broski. I've been doing a lot of thinking lately. In all honesty, I do a lot of thinking, more than necessary. It wouldn't kill me to think just a tad bit less about things, but regardless, I've been thinking. This is a topic that I've discussed with friends, but usually I don't let myself go on for too long because, oh my god, I can yap, and I'd want to spare them from my fiction based brain rot of this variety because it is so interwoven into so many of my interests, I may never shut up. So it's just better if I don't start. But this is YouTube. People yap on here all the time, so I'm gonna share a crumb of my brain rot with you, specifically about the responsibility of fiction. It's something that I think about a lot as someone who creates multiple forms of content, including a webcomic that I'm constantly reflecting on. I don't think this is being discussed enough in a nuanced way. It feels like there's a X thing is bad and irresponsible and you're a shit writer and a horrible person if you put this in your work kind of reactive mentality when discussing this kind of thing, so I wanted to approach the topic with my own thoughts. For context, when I'm referring to media in this video, mean any creative media with a narrative involved. Books, games, comics, shows, that sort of jam. There's an overall consensus that media can have a positive impact on viewership. Just look at any of the discussions on how representation can help people feel validated in their lived experience or more comfortable in their identity. And I think everyone has had at least one experience where a piece of media has given them a new perspective on the world around them. Then why is it so controversial that media can have a negative impact on those who view it? People are really quick to respond with, it's just a show, or not people forgetting it's just a game, online. When it comes to critical critique of media, especially when people are upset with how something is being handled. I've personally mostly seen these types of comments under videos on TikTok that are critiquing shows and how they may or may not have been handled well with whatever subject matter, or at least not as well as it could have. I can't help but feel this response is reductive. It really takes for granted the work put into the narrative or what people take from it. Yeah, maybe it is just fiction, but that doesn't mean it's without merit and isn't worth discussion. As we continue to create media as a species, it's important that artists reflect on what they are depicting and what we are saying with our work, especially when we consider the Jaws effect. Jaw effect? Like those TMJ disorders? Well, no. Despite that more than likely being the first thing that pops up on to your search engine if you look up jaw effect, and forget to put the in the front of it for some reason. The Jaws movie released in 1975, based off the book of the same name, written by Peter Benchley in the 70s. It collected about a very big number in the box office. I'll put it up on the screen. You can read it yourself. I'm not even going to try in its first release in theaters. Being an extremely successful film, both financially and in critical acclaim. You see, the fear of sharks didn't start with the movie, but now that the movie was in the public eye, people became far more wary of sharks, seeing them as these sea monsters out for human blood. Whilst in reality, humans aren't really on the menu for sharks, only about 12 out of the 300 known shark species have been linked to shark attacks. We have far more reason to be afraid of dolphins than sharks, and don't get me started on otters. They're not dangerous to people, just kind of deplorable in the way they conduct themselves in the wild. Don't let those cute faces fool you. If they had the ability to, they would be conducting war crimes. Some sharks can actually be incredibly docile. There's one experience a diver had with a tiger shark, where over the course of multiple dives, the shark started to approach out of curiosity, most likely, and would get close enough to even touch. The diver would then reach out and rub its snout, checking for fish hooks that might have gotten stuck into her snout and remove them. And also probably to keep the 15-foot fish from directly headbutting into him. Since then, the shark consistently joins this dude on his dives, 20 years after their initial meeting. Describing Emma, the shark, to have the same personality as a Labrador retriever. Also, whale sharks, in all honesty, I think they look kind of terrifying, but that's just because I'm thalassophobic, and big fish in open water is the last thing I ever want to encounter, but I can't argue that they are objectively cute, and the least dangerous shark, being filter feeders. They have no reason or real experience taking a chomp out of anything, or anyone, and divers often swim alongside them. I'm not going to say go jump in the ocean and hug the first shark you see, especially whale shark, due to the fact that a lot of marine life has a thick layer of mucus that is integral for the creature's health, which humans can easily damage by petting, stroking, or clinging onto whilst trying to hitch a ride. That being said, they're still large predators, and while uncommon, there's often a risk with the majority of shark species. Accidents happen, especially in murky waters, where they may confuse us for something more edible, or they may feel threatened. Sharks are and should be afraid of us. Due to there being so many docile species, some of them are fed in front of tourists as entertainment, which sounds sweet, but not everyone has good intentions. And a shark has no way of knowing the difference between a fishing boat and a boat full of people about to throw them food. Side tangent, the fishing and hunting of sharks is completely unethical. The only edible part of a shark is its fins. So they kill a shark just for maybe a few bites of meat. Jaws did severe damage to the shark population. Mass shark killings decreased the population by 71% due to the fear-mongering around sharks that started from the popularization of the movie. The original author of the book was horrified. The ocean is like 70% of the globe. It was untouchable. Or that's what I assume his reaction was. How was he supposed to know this story would spiral out of his hands and into the public eye, and that his story would have so much influence on the global ecosystem? He did confirm that he regretted writing the book and dedicated the rest of his life to marine conservation. I believe in partial death of the author. Whilst a piece of media can never be completely separated from its creator, and looking back at who made the work for context can add an incredibly interesting layer to how the viewer experiences their work. But most people won't do that. Most people enjoy the story as it is, whilst the creator's politics, interests, philosophy, and personal experiences are interwoven into the fabric of the media. The viewer will also bring all this to the table themselves, effectively skewing what the original intent of the story may or may not have been. Once a piece of work is distributed, how it will be interpreted and perceived is now out of the creator's hands and in the hands of the audience who chooses to indulge in it. The "why are the curtains blue" meme is a way of making fun of the education system trying to get their students to hyperanalyze the readings they were assigned, trying to get into the author's head. The joke being, maybe the curtains are just blue. Maybe there isn't anything more to look into it. And you know what? That very well may be true. The author may have just wanted to describe the curtains and went, what color can curtains be? Blue. But regardless, there might be meaning found in the color. Maybe the blue color could have represented a bitter coldness that the protagonist feels coming from the one they love. Or it could be referring to the deep sorrowful tone that is being set by the overall narrative of this scene, trying to hammer in how dismal our protagonist's situation is, or even something world building related. Maybe blue is the color that's used by the rebellion of this nation, and having blue curtains can be interpreted as a quiet act of defiance. None of this may have been meant by the author, or maybe it was. We have no way of knowing unless the author comes out and tells us straight up. It's really up to the audience to interpret the story and what it's trying to say. We look at everything through the lens of our own experiences, making the narrative digested by the viewer some Frankenstein's monster of both the author's and reader's thoughts and sensibilities. There are certainly things that can be done by the creator to try to make the narrative clear and digestible in the way that they intend, but there's only so much that can be done before it feels like the creator is just looking down on their audience's intellect, which can break immersion in the story and hurt the trust between the audience and the creator. Even when enjoying media passively, stories implant or confirm biases in the consumer, which makes it all the more important to reflect on the media you consume and said personal biases. A lot of media has been historically propagandized and, in many countries and cultures, censored. In America, through 1934 all the way to the 1960s, the Hays Code was enforced. A list of banned subjects in movies. The list included brutal killings, detailed descriptions of how to commit crimes, drug trafficking, excessive depiction of liquor, adultery treated attractively, sex scenes, explicit depictions of seduction or assault, sex perversion, white slavery, miscegenation, aka interracial marriage, sex hygiene and vaginal disease, scenes of childbirth, vulgarity, obscenity, profanity, nudity, indecent exposure, solicitous, indecent, or obscene titles, dances suggesting or representing sexual actions or emphasizing indecent movements, and the mocking of religion. Okay, in all transparency, there's technically one band that I left out that refers to the indecent exposure of children. I don't think that's controversial, so I'm leaving it out of the conversation. But I didn't want to not mention I took out of the list either, because I don't want to be altering any information just to prove a point. So there was one item on the list that I think we can all agree on. Now we can discuss everything else more critically. Cool? Cool. America saw its people as morally as strong as tissue paper and believed exposed to the wrong influence, it could corrupt the fragile mind of its citizens. Yeah, fantastic idea. Let's just make nearly 3 decades of art that doesn't reflect reality. That won't do any long lasting damage. While I could see why people might think some of these might have been worth being banned, still, I'd like to implore these people to think about what these bans actually imply. It's definitely trying to protect the status quo at the time, which was oppressive to anyone who wasn't an able bodied cishet white man. There are so many things I could tackle here, and things I want to discuss further. But to discuss all the main points I'd want to make with the nuance it deserves, this video would be an extra 2 hours. So I'll stick to the point that I understand the best and have the most thoughts on, and hopefully can add something informative and new-ish to the conversation, since a lot of this has already been covered by others in more detail, probably. This code is obviously built to not tempt people away from what's expected of them. Certainly not to lead anyone to consider crime. You see, these bans meant that protagonists couldn't be interesting. I mean, couldn't have any traits that would go against this Hays Code. So there was a very narrow amount of characteristics you could comfortably give your protagonist while staying compliant. So if the author wanted to play with anything that would be considered unsavory, they would have to give the trait to an antagonist, or someone who would be promptly punished for their actions by the end of the story. And thus the queer villain was born. I'm not saying that the queer villain trope started with the Hays Code, but I am willing to bet one of my moderately vital organs that it solidified the queer villain as a popular character trope in media. Also, villains are cool, self-assured, shameless, and tend to love themselves and be proud of who they are. Obviously, there are exceptions to the rule, but I think these are some of the common characteristics associated with the queer villain. The trope gave cishet audiences something to root against, but also gave queer audiences someone that they could somewhat relate to. I'm sure there were queer filmmakers who wrote what they wish they could have more openly shared about themselves in the villains they wrote. Of course, they were also cishet creators using the trope to write something to feel more foreign and thus intimidating. With that being said, I think there were many creators that wrote villains to express the queer experience as best that they could while still protecting themselves. We will never really know, though, how many queer villains were written by queer people, because I assume the majority of them never really came out of the closet. With this being said, the trope did cause harm, continuing to gear public opinion against queer people when the only queer people they are exposed to are in media, and that media only depicts them as self-centered, conniving villains. It's harder to empathize with the monster when you don't see yourself in them. Also, side tangent, the topic of monsters and queer people seeing themselves in them is an incredibly interesting topic that I could chew on for hours if given the time and content to sift through. I'm just saying. I'd let Carmilla drink my blood. Hear me out. That book inspired Dracula. She's the original hot vampire, and she likes women. So all I'm saying is I'd be happy to donate to her cause. But not the Carmilla from Castlevania. Look, I support women's rights and wrongs, but she's genuinely evil and not even particularly fruity. I'll pass. The Hays Code was stomped out of effect in 1968 and replaced with the Motion Picture Association of American Film Ratings, which is the ratings we have on movies today, like G, PG-13, and rated R films, to give viewership a heads up about the intensity of the film. Due to the length of time it was enforced, it really solidified what is expected and not expected in media, and really hammered in some tropes with a problematic history, such as the queer villain. But this act also more than likely had far more reaching impacts on media and our overall society today that we can't even really begin to comprehend the insane amount of butterfly effect that was enacted by these limitations without doing a ton of research. The point I'm trying to make is as a creator, you're responsible for the ideas your work puts into the world and how that may impact people who consume it. Now, I'm not saying don't make your readers sad, make them bawl their eyes out if possible, but I am saying put out ideas you're willing to stand by. I'm also not saying you can't write characters with different beliefs than you, and I'm definitely not saying spoon feed your audience. I'm not going to tell you how things can and cannot be approached because I'm a singular creature. I don't know how best to approach anything. Only you can know what's best for your work. It's just important to reflect on the biases you're putting in said work and the way you handle your tropes. And as a consumer, you are responsible for keeping yourself in check. Maybe a character died and you found that you just didn't care. Was that because the character was only on screen for 3 minutes? Was it because they were poorly written? Was it because they rubbed you the wrong way? And honestly, wish they had kicked the bucket sooner so you wouldn't have to have dealt with them for another minute? Or is it because the character is different from you? Or something you were taught to fear? Is this lack of empathy a deep set bias that should be reflected on, or the result of how the piece of media was constructed? But what if you don't want to be responsible? What if you want to write something abhorrent you'd never actually stand by in terms of themes and message? But damn, it's fun to write and interesting fantasy to explore. Or is it something that you just know, if taken in by the wrong crowd, would take away the wrong message and could do some actual harm? And to that I say, you know what? That's extremely fair. As long as you don't plan on broadcasting your work to a broader mainstream audience, I really don't see a problem. Just look at Archive of Our Own. Whilst primarily used for fan fiction, it's an incredibly open place where you can write just about anything you want. As long as you tag your work properly, you're all good. People don't yuck each other's yums on there, and more importantly, they can distinguish fiction from reality and look at what they're consuming, enjoy it, and recognize that it isn't a depiction of the reality that they live in, and can also enjoy work for its merits without running off with horrendous perceptions of others. Because mainstream audiences don't often do that and may take things at face value. Not to say that we can't trust general audiences to have a stronger moral fortitude than tissue paper, it's just uncommon for people to look at media critically. They will passively ingest themes more often than not. So it's important to consider what themes you're putting into mainstream audiences and how you're handling it. I'm not saying certain themes and messages are off limits for mainstream audiences. I think that we should be very open about a lot of things, and I think a lot of things are necessary to be discussed. But I think how we handle these is what's important. It's less we need to not talk about X, Y, and Z. It's more talking about them respectfully and with the nuance that they deserves and without dragging anyone else down with you in your narrative. As long as you publicize your work in a way that isn't throwing it straight to the wolves, you'll be fine. I know this section feels vague. I don't really feel like it's my place to pick out examples and condemn or uplift them, since it would be large sweeping statements with a hypothetical type vibe. A lot of what makes stories what it is the nuance and details of it. At the end of the day, everything has been done before. Everything is a remix of everything the artist has consumed, experienced, and regurgitated in an aesthetic pile that hopefully comes out looking more than just thoughtless slop. If I were to discuss particular examples in media I've experienced and ingested, that would also take a lot of explaining and deconstruction. And at that point, I'd rather make another video essay reviewing that one piece of media and that aspect of it in depth. If any of that makes sense. Obviously, if you notice that I said anything wrong, feel free to fact check me in the comments or just toss out your thoughts if you have anything you'd like to add to the conversation. At worst, we can agree to disagree. I'll also be tossing out some resources in the description if you want to look into any of this further on your own. I hope you enjoyed this, by the way, or at least found it mildly interesting. This is my first attempt at a video essay, so I'm sure there was some things I could have done better or made more interesting, but I don't think it's horrible for my first time I've done this. Anyway, I hope you all have a fantastic rest of your day. Thank you for stopping by, and don't forget to hydrate before you dehydrate. See you later.